Hello second years, welcome to your flipped learning video for free will versus determinism. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to set the scene a little bit with a story. Now this story is relevant both to free will and determinism, although I'm not sure that I would use it in exams, so be really careful, but it gives you a feel of the concept of determinism and what it is a little bit. And also, it's relevant again as a bit of background for the psychodynamic approach that we look at. So I wouldn't necessarily make any notes beyond saying that this is a story of Oedipus and is an example of, it's an ancient Greek tragedy, an ancient Greek myth, and it demonstrates the concept of determinism, which is what we'll be looking at. So Oedipus was born as a baby to a king and a queen, and the king went to an oracle who prophesied that that the baby Oedipus would one day kill his father and marry his mother. So his father was very worried about this, understandably. So a slight overreaction, went into the woods and left baby Oedipus in the woods in the hope that he would die and therefore his father would be protected. He was found and adopted by a family who took him on, and he was raised as their own. He found out about the prophecy that he would kill his father and marry his mother, and he was horrified by this, believing that his adoptive parents were his biological parents, and so left to protect them. As he was leaving and travelling to another city, he met a man, and they fought over crossroads and who would be allowed to go first. And he got cross and he killed the man who, shockingly, turned out to be his biological father. Oedipus was still not aware of this. He then went on to, in a series of events, to marry the dead wife's wife, who was his mother. So he fulfilled his destiny. So again, I wouldn't use this in your exam necessarily, but it gives quite a sort of more philosophical view of the concept of determinism. So even if you try and fight it, it leads back. Your behaviour is predetermined. What you are going to do is decided by various factors before you even act on those behaviours. And as poor Oedipus showed, you cannot escape those behaviours. Okay, so here is the specification. You've done gender and cultural bias, and now we're into free will and determinism. And the key terms you need to know are free will, determinism, hard determinism, soft determinism, biological, environmental, and psychic determinism as well. And then the phrase, the scientific emphasis on causal relationships, or causal explanation, sorry. Of course, causal explanations, you can't have a relationship. If we're talking about a correlation, correlation does not show cause and effect, it only shows a relationship. So the scientific emphasis on causal explanations, I would make a note of that phrase because you'll be really comfortable with the concept. If I talked about cause and effect, you could tell me everything about that. It's just if it ever came up in an exam where it used the phrase, the scientific emphasis on causal explanations, then you might panic, but actually you're already strongly aware of it. Okay, just a couple of the types of questions, as simple as name two types of determinism for 2 marks, with reference to a behaviour. So again, this is where this skill of application comes in, where you need to think about areas in the specification, make links with areas in the specification. That's determinism, that allows for free will, and you can draw them in. And that's to explain the distinction between hard and soft determinism. So you have to understand and be able to compare all of these definitions as well. Then there's a stimulus that's been given, and explain what's meant by determinism, refer to the aggressive behaviours, and of course the classic, discuss free will and determinism within psychology. And that could be alongside a stimulus, and they have had a 16 marker with a stimulus attached to it. It could be refer to at least one topic, so you have to think of topics that evidence determinism, and the third one of course could just be, as it is, discussing free will versus determinism, but hopefully you would automatically draw links from other areas in the spec to support that. Okay, and then another one as well, so another stimulus with explain what's meant by determinism, refer to 3 types of determinism in your answer, and and then also underneath you've got identify an influence of nature and nurture. So they can combine the issues and debates together as well. This one, it's extremely important to be really, really careful and not fall into the trap of talking about nature and nurture, but in fact free will and determinism. So nature and nurture are both deterministic approaches, essentially, or concepts or understandings. Is it nature that decides our behaviour, or is it nurture that decides our behaviour? Free will versus determinism, as we'll talk in a lot more detail in a minute, is our behaviour determined? And then there's opportunity to discuss, if the answer is yes, it's determined, is it nature, is it nurture? Whereas, and free will is, can we make our own choices? So you have to be really, really careful. Nature and nurture are a separate debate that only acknowledge determinism, whereas determinism versus free will considers, is our behaviour determined? Is it predetermined, like Oedipus, or do we have some free will and choice over it? Okay, so all of these terms, there has been an exam question, and all of these terms and these definitions have come from the mark scheme of it. So you can be confident they're exactly what AQA are looking for. Now, you can have some flexibility, and if you explained it effectively without using this exact definition, that would be absolutely fine. You wouldn't lose marks because as long as you were still discussing the concepts, but you can be reassured that the definitions are directly from AQA themselves. So we've got the idea of free will, and this is what most people would assume or consider that we have when we make our decisions. This would be most people's natural standpoint. The idea that we're able to choose how we behave. If you really think about it, and how you feel about the decisions that you make in your life, do you feel that you've got wherever you wanted to go based purely on your free will and your decisions? It was your choice. You made a choice about how to behave, and you weren't influenced by anything else. This very much aligns with the humanistic psychology. So the humanists are probably one of the few psychologists that believe in free will, that people are able to make choices. Now, free will acknowledges that there are other factors. So, for example, nature or nurture, so our environment or our biology can influence our decisions, but ultimately we are self-determining, and that's quite an important term. We are self-determining. We can choose how we behave. And the humanist approach is really focused on that, and in fact was developed and brought in, and we'll look at the humanist approach as one of the additional approaches we need to look at, was developed and brought in because humanist psychologists so strongly opposed the fact that every other approach was very deterministic, and psychologists were denying the fact that we had any free will or right to choose. So store that in your mind, because you will be having to apply the definitions to different approaches. As you've seen, we've already started that. Oh, and up here on the right-hand side, hopefully you can remember from cultural bias, this is an example of Maslow's hierarchy of need. So you've got your physiological and safety needs, love and belonging, esteem, and then finally you achieve self-actualization. And humanists very much support this concept of moving up and down the Maslow's hierarchy. Determinism, so exactly as it says on the slides, the general idea that traits and behaviours are outside our control, and they're due to factors either internal or external over which we have no control. So this is the idea that it's the generic concept of determinism before we start looking at separate and individual ones. So it's the idea that we have no choice. So if we could explain Oedipus through one of these terms, it would be through determinism. Our behaviour is predetermined or decided for us without our control. And actually and Skinner talks about this a lot, free will is an illusion. We believe that we control our behaviours, but we do not control them. And as you can see down here, there's an image which kind of explains the idea of determinism, so our past influencing our future, and then free will is the idea that the past that we're living in, there are many different ways that we could head in our future. So there are several types of determinism. There is a biological determinism. And this is the idea that traits and behaviours are governed by internal biological factors like genes, neurochemistry, brain structure and function. So the idea that biology is chemistry, is destiny. Okay, I'm just going to go back to determinism for one more moment, actually. So we will come back to biological determinism. However, all I want to add about determinism is the idea that it is very compatible with science, scientific beliefs, and the study of science. So science very much holds the belief that every behaviour or everything has a cause, and this is where we fall into the idea of causal causal explanations, or as you might be more familiar with it, with the term we use a lot, cause and effect. So determinism is the idea that every effect, every behaviour has a cause, and if we can identify the cause, then we can predict the effect. So this is where determinism, where science is so important, because if science wasn't deterministic, then we wouldn't bother with theories, because theories allow us to predict human behaviour. So if this happens, this will happen. And also it would be pointless for us to conduct psychological research, because our focus in psychological research is to identify cause and effect. This causes this effect, anything that we are studying. Okay, so that is really, really important if you can squeeze that in. Determinism is very compatible with science because it allows us to predict. So theories allow us to predict if this happens, this will happen, and we conduct experiments to identify cause and effect as well. So if scientists weren't deterministic, if it was all free will, then we wouldn't be able to predict anybody's behaviour, so we couldn't have theories, and there wouldn't be any cause and effect, so there was no point conducting experiments to identify cause and effect. And that's where that idea, that term from the spec, the scientific emphasis on causal explanations, so that's where that comes from. That's what you could talk about. Determinism is focused on causal explanations and cause and effect. So biological determinism is the idea that we're governed by internal factors, so genes, neurochemistry, brain structure, and function. And this idea of biology is destiny. So there are lots of different ways that we could look at this, and I've picked two off the specification, but if you prefer other things in aggression, cognitive development, something else that you've studied with Andy, attachment, then you are more than welcome to use those. But just to illustrate two of the points, we've got fight or flight response. So this one, quite clearly, the behaviour of fight or flight is biologically determined. We have no control over it. So a stimulus happens and we respond to that. Biologically, we're caused to respond to that. We have no choice. If you think back to Andy's lesson, or if you ever think of watching a scary movie and you jump, you have no control over that. So it's biologically determined and influenced by our autonomic nervous system. Yeah. Excellent. Then the other one that you study with me in psychopathology is OCD. So this is the idea that if you have the CERT or the COMT gene, then you will develop OCD. Because the idea, if you think about neural, so therefore, and they link together. So if you have problems with the CERT gene, then your serotonin is reabsorbed through reuptake too quickly, and you will have very little serotonin floating around in the synaptic gap to bind to the postsynaptic neuron. And also the COMT gene is destroying dopamine too quickly, so is setting off a chain of events which destroy dopamine too quickly, which means sorry, no, it's not. Apologies. It's setting off a chain of events. So there aren't as many enzymes to destroy dopamine. So therefore, there is too much dopamine. There we go. So damage to the CERT gene, low levels of serotonin because it's being reabsorbed through uptake too quickly. Damage to the COMT gene, then the enzymes are not destroying the dopamine quickly enough. So there is too much dopamine in the synaptic gap. And there's also issues with brain structure. So that fits all, doesn't it? Genes, neurochemistry, so neurotransmitters, and then you've got the brain structure. You've got the problem with the OFC, the filter that is trying to stop all of the worry signals getting to the thalamus, which isn't working effectively. So that's a problem with the structure and the function of the brain. This would also fit with, I'm sure, lots of other explanations, like I say, with Andy, so the MAOA gene and all of those things. But it's the idea that if you have these biological causes in place, then you will experience the effect of OCD. So again, cause and effect. This damage to the genes causes this behaviour. Okay, so it's predetermined, we have no choice. Environmental determinism, the idea that traits and behaviours are governed by external forces such as experience, upbringing, learning, school, parents, peers, etc. So this is the idea that our behaviour isn't through our own choice, but it is through things that happen in our environment, the way that we respond to things in the environment. And we've got the example of classical conditioning here in learning through association. For example, Pavlov's dogs had no choice. They associated the food with the noise of the tuning fork, and eventually the behaviour, the response to the tuning fork became conditioned to be the salivation, and there was no control or conscious thought over that. And I'm sure you can think of other things in classical conditioning. So if you think about little Albert developing the phobia, he had no choice. He couldn't decide not to develop the phobia. He developed the phobia because he associated white rats with the loud banging noise. As well. The same with operant conditioning. So we have no choice, we just are products that respond to reinforcement or punishment. So reinforcement in the environment will increase a behaviour, whereas punishment in the environment will decrease a behaviour, and that is not, we don't choose to increase or decrease the behaviour, it is determined by the environmental factor of reinforcement or punishment. Okay. Another one here with it mentioning parents and peers is social learning theory and aggression, which I know you're looking at with Andy at the moment. So social learning theory, if we observe a behaviour and we are motivated and it's vicariously reinforced, then we will imitate that behaviour. Okay, there's a slight difference there, because classical and operant conditioning are environmental determinism, and they are an example of hard determinism in environmental determinism. You can be several different ones of these. So that's the idea that you will associate, if two stimuluses are paired, you will associate them, or if you experience reinforcement or punishment, you will respond to those with increasing or decreasing a behaviour. Social learning theory, if you observe a behaviour and it's vicariously reinforced, you will imitate it. However, there is an element of cognitive in there, and cognitive allows for an element of choice and free will, and therefore we would call it soft determinism. It's not suggesting that our behaviours are completely due to free will, but it's acknowledging that we have an element of choice within that. So just remember that they can, within each one of these, you can talk about soft and hard determinism as well. The terms are not mutually exclusive. So if you think about the role of mediation or process, that's what makes social learning theory environmental, but soft determinism. So we're being influenced by something in the environment, but we have an element of choice by deciding, are we motivated to imitate that behaviour? And then psychic determinism, which at the moment will be the most tricky one for you because you haven't studied psychodynamic, and it directly links to psychodynamic and Freud. But these are the idea that traits and behaviours are governed by unconscious instincts and drives. So the cause of behaviour is rooted in childhood experience. And again, this will fit more nicely with Freud. And then you've got the id, the ego, and the superego, which some of you may have come across before. And these are all unconscious instincts and drives, particularly the id and the superego. So the id, if you think about the angel and the devil on the shoulder, they're parts of our unconscious personality. So the id is all about the pleasure principle, so just the desire for immediate gratification. So if the id is hungry, it will just take something and eat it, or if you're angry, you'll just punch someone in the face, and that's driven by an unconscious instinct or drive. You might not know where it came from. Sometimes you might suddenly realise that you're shouting at someone and you don't know why. That would be the id, and it's determining your behaviour. You're not choosing that, it's determining it. Superego is the other side. It's the angel. It's driven on the morality principle. And it's the idea that we should only do good. And again, so Freud argues that any good behaviours are motivated by the superego, and we might not know why we're doing them. We might think we know why we're doing them, or we're making a choice, but actually it's the unconscious instinct from our superego is driving us. Okay, some other ones, and don't panic too much if you're not sure about this one, because until we study the psychodynamic approach, this one will be harder for you. Okay, some of you might have heard of Freudian slips. So that's the idea that you say one thing when you mean another, or the joke is you say one thing when you mean your mother. So the idea that occasionally you might say something, you might mistakenly swap words over or say something different to what you mean. Freud claimed that wasn't a mistake. It was your unconscious instincts or drives forcing you to say that other word. So determining that behaviour. Again, we don't think we've got any choice over it. We don't have any choice over it. That's the words that we say. And then the psychosexual stages. So you will look at these with again in psychodynamic, but you've got oral, anal, phallic, latent, and genital. And these are the idea that there are certain stages that you develop similar to Piaget, although slightly different, similar to Piaget. And if you have, and there are certain areas of the body that are the pleasure source that you focus on at those certain ages. And if you have any kind of trauma or a problem within those stages, then you will develop what Freud called a fixation. So in the oral stage, this was the focus is on mouth and pleasure from the mouth. Therefore, if you're weaned off breastfeeding too early, then Freud argued you would, as an adult, smoke, overeat, or bite your nails as some examples of fixations. So there's no free choice or free will in the fact you haven't made a choice to smoke. It's an unconscious instinct that's being driven by the fact that you had a conflict in the oral stage. Or the same with the anal stage. If there was a problem in the anal stage with your toilet training, you were embarrassed, or it wasn't quite done right, it was done too early, it wasn't done early enough, then you have anally retentive, which is where a common term that you've heard of comes from before. You have the anally retentive fixation, which is where you become really, really orderly. And if you've been watching Netflix and Friends recently, Monica's a really good example of that. Or anal expulsive, which is really messy, and Phoebe's more of an example of that, so really disorganized. So again, it's this idea of, if we go back to the definition, that your behaviors are being governed by unconscious instincts. So you're not choosing to be messy. So if anyone tells you off for being messy, you might want to tell them, although you may not want to, that explain that clearly something traumatic happened to you in Freud's anal stage, and so it's not your fault, it's not a choice, it is a predetermined behaviour that you were always meant to have. I'm not sure if you would maybe just accept perhaps that someone's saying you're a bit messy. Okay, so that is some types. There are two other types of determinism which I just touched on briefly. So hard determinism, traits and behaviours entirely out of the individual's control, and this is focused fully on the concept of cause and effect. If this happens, this will happen. And you could argue, whilst there are again, you can have different types of determinism within this. So hard determinism. So some explanations in the biological approach are due to hard determinism, such as OCD. If you have this gene, you will develop OCD. Or also environmental. So association. If two stimuluses are paired together, you will learn to associate them, and you will have this response. So it's hard determinism. And then soft determinism. So traits and behaviours are determined by external or internal forces. So they're acknowledging determinism, but an individual can still exercise some control, generally through, although this is just one example, through thought processes. And this is the cognitive approach. And the perfect example for this one is social learning theory. So environmentally, you will observe somebody you will experience vicarious reinforcement for a behaviour, but the role of mediational process allows you to make some decisions around that. And we'll come back to that in a minute, because cognitive approaches develops treatments based on the idea that we do exercise some control. And then the images at the bottom, so the nice little brain there is for cognitive approach. And then the two images, so you've got the guy in court saying my DNA made me do it, and that's very much a hard deterministic approach, the idea that if you have this genetic disorder, you will display this abnormal, using the psychological idea of abnormal normal behaviour as he's in a courtroom by the looks of it. And then soft determinism is the idea that you are dealt, so in a game of cards, bridge is the type of cards, you're dealt a certain hand. So that's determinism. But then the way that you can make some choices about how you play and how you use that hand. And there it says that's about free will, which I would argue together builds the idea of soft determinism. So you have these certain hands, or for example, you have these certain genetic conditions. However, biological conditions, we have this certain environment. However, you can make some choices. Okay, because a lot of people feel that hard determinism is too strict, is too extreme an approach. Okay, right, so what we're going to do here, and I've worked very hard so as much as possible you can just flip these round. So when you can either argue for and against determinism, or a for determinism is an against for free will, and we can flip them round. So I've worked really hard for you not to have to remember much, because I know you have quite a lot to remember. So this should hopefully will make it easier. And also I've tried to make the fors and the against bounce off each other as well. So a for determinism is that there is supporting evidence to suggest that determinism does exist. So Liebert in 1985 conducted some research where he asked participants to make hand movements, and one of the hand movements was just moving the fingers. He'd strapped them up to an EEG machine, and he was measuring their brainwave activity. And he said, whenever you would like to, I would like you to decide to wiggle your fingers, do some kind of hand movement. All I'd like you to do is, as you make that decision, I would like you to note the time. So when the minute in your brain you go, right, I'm going to move my finger, I'd like to move my fingers, I'd like to note what time it is. And he found that hundreds of milliseconds before participants were reporting that they had made the decision to move their hands, there was already brain activity suggesting that that their hands were going to be moved, suggesting that their brain had already made the decision before they made the conscious decision to do this. Okay, that suggests that there is, even in behaviours that appear completely at random, completely based down to choice, that actually there is biological behaviours or causes happening even before the conscious decision is made. Okay, so that's a bit scary. Soon et al., 2013, also replicated this. So they argued that, with ever so slightly different method, they argued that things as simple as decisions about movement weren't complex enough. If you think about the kind of choices and decisions that we make, they don't truly represent the more complex decisions that we have to make. So they tried to, while still allowing to make it experimental, they tried to develop some theories, some experiments or studies which gave slightly more complex decisions. And they provided participants with maths problems, and they asked them to make a decision, and exactly the same process again, record the time they made this decision, make the decision, are they going to add or are they going to multiply these numbers together. And they found that in exactly the same way as Liebert's, there was a decision made in the brain before the conscious milliseconds before the conscious participants realized they'd made the conscious decision. And what Libert and Soon argued was that, and there's a really good video that I've put in the notes of this PowerPoint, and I'll try to remember to put in the description of it as well. If not, let me know and I can share it with you, because it's less than 2 minutes long, but it really clearly explains Libet and a couple of the conclusions that he drew. But they drew the conclusion that the decision was, the perhaps conscious decision making was actually a reporting a decision that had already been made. And they had this little graphic of somebody on a ship running with a report and passing it to the captain. And that's what they suggested that conscious decision making was. It was almost a report of the biological decision that had been already made without any conscious thought underneath. Okay. Don't worry if you're not sure about that last bit, but ultimately, of course, the fact that we can predict behaviours, there is a cause which isn't being controlled by the person, suggests that it's due to free will. So there is a cause and effect. Okay. Another argument for holding a deterministic view is that it allows us to develop treatments. So if we hold a deterministic view in science, we can identify a cause and an effect. For example, OCD, low levels of serotonin, high levels of dopamine will lead to OCD. Then it allows us to develop treatments. So and arguably those treatments are very effective. For example, we use SSRIs with OCD, and they are more effective, apologies, I should say more effective than a placebo. So suggesting that they are effective. So that's an effective treatment that comes from the idea there is a cause, low serotonin, high dopamine, and we can remove that cause, therefore removing the effect of OCD. And the same with systematic desensitization. So you could choose either of these. OCD is obviously biological determinism, and then systematic desensitization is environmental determinism. We've associated a fear stimulus with a fear response. So systematic desensitization works to counter condition those behaviours so that the fear stimulus causes a relaxation response. Again, it's that cause and effect idea, and that has been found in research to be 75% effective. Hopefully neither of those facts about OCD and systematic desensitization treatments, SSRIs, are a surprise to you, because they were on your flip learning. So I'm trying again for you to draw comparisons. So if those behaviours are those treatments are both effective, that would suggest that the idea of determinism is a sound concept or a sound approach to take, because we're managing a cause and therefore removing a cause and therefore removing an effect. Okay. Against determinism is that there are flaws in Libet's research. For example, it's extremely hard to be confident in the validity of, or it's very difficult to operationalize a measure of something as subjective as what time somebody makes a decision. So we're relying on self-report, and self-report, of course, requires self-awareness, and it's incredibly difficult to pinpoint exactly when you make a decision, especially when we're talking in milliseconds. Okay, so that's an extremely short period of time. So actually, that gap could be the gap between the thinking time, the person making the decision, and then verbalizing that realizing they've made that decision. So it's very hard to operationalize the subjective concept of when we've made a decision. Libet himself didn't believe in hard determinism, so he didn't actually support the conclusion that there was no free will from his studies. What he suggested instead is there's something called free won't, and this is the idea that whilst decisions are made unconsciously before we're even aware of them, so we don't have free will necessarily, we have the choice not to act on those decisions, and that's what he called free won't. So he argued that we still have some choice in our decision making, and it's all in that video that's 2 minutes long with some lovely graphics of a pirate ship in there. Also, an argument against determinism, especially hard determinism, is the idea that effective treatments which rely on there are effective treatments which rely on free will, and this is CBT. So, of course, this is the idea that it's our thought processes that cause depression, and therefore, we can choose to alter or manage or change our thought processes to allow us to be happy and not to experience depression. And again, CBT is something that we've studied, so hopefully it's not new to you all, and CBT is 90% effective, but that was found by Ellis, who was the person who developed it, so we have to think quite carefully about that. But CBT has been found to be very effective, and it shouldn't be if free will didn't exist, because we're making a decision or a conscious choice to change the way that we think and therefore the way that we behave. Okay. Also, the final thing with determinism, is that there are. Let me have a think if I want that one. If that would actually be in support of determinism. 1 second. Yeah, absolutely. Should have had complete faith myself. So one thing I will say, because there is actually another point after this one, is there are quite a lot of fors and against here. I wouldn't expect you to use them all. I would expect you to pick the ones that you feel most happy with. And we want you to be able to argue, as exactly like evaluation points, argue three arguments altogether. So 1 for, 2 against, 2 fors, 1 against, something like that. I'd recommend though that you would go with 4, and I would have them linking to each other as well. But it is entirely up to you which ones you choose. And that is an example of, I guess, an argument of soft determinism. So I'm going to give you some examples. So therefore you have to use those examples, but you can choose which ones you use. That's an example of soft determinism. Arguably, though, you can go off and find your own. If you feel more confident there are some better explanations or ones that you understand more effectively, then please do. But just make sure you can have that debate, that for and against that debate. Okay? An argument would be, if we accept determinism, that will cause huge issues with our justice system. Our justice system is based on the idea that we've made a free choice to behave in a way that is illegal or breaks the law. For example, if we go with the really extreme one of murdering, or committing murder, we believe the justice system is based on the fact that we have made the decision to commit a crime. So therefore, acknowledging that everything was based on determinism will cause huge problems for how our justice system would work. Could anybody be actually found guilty? And this is something that, especially law students, you could possibly even go into more in depth, because I know there are certain factors that are discussed that in law that allow for some an element of determinism. So these factors were made, the client's choice took the choice out of the client's hands. So that's something that might particularly suit legal students, as long as you didn't get too lost in the law element of it in the exam. Okay. And finally, another one, and the only reason I've included this one is because it's a good point, but also it talks about falsifiability, so it links it back to something that you're already aware of. So a feature of science. So as we know, a really important feature of science is falsifiability, the ability for us to test and disprove something. We can prove nothing, but we must be able to test and disprove something. And determinism is the idea that we were always destined to display a certain behaviour, so that was always going to happen. It's not always possible for us to it's not possible for us to test that. If that behaviour was always going to be there, how are we possible to conduct research to try and challenge that idea as well? So it's based on the idea that causes of behaviour will always exist, even though they may not yet have been found. So as a basic principle, this is impossible to prove. Okay, so you cannot disprove the idea that a behaviour that we argued would always exist is caused by something. And ultimately, that suggests that whilst determinism is really useful as for cause and effect and for science, for testing, identifying cause and effect, allowing us to develop effective theories which predict human behaviour, and also conduct research that identifies cause and effect, there's actually some serious problems with scientific problems with determinism, suggesting it's an unscientific or lacks a scientific approach. Okay, so remember, I would argue 4 of each that allow you to have a good for and against debate. So it'd be quite good to have 2 that bounce off each other. Do not panic, because I know we still have free will to go. However, hopefully you can breathe a sigh of relief because you recognise all of these. So whilst I've put the 4 on the left, if I was using Libet and soon as against free will, I would talk about those first, and then I would go back to the flaws, because it would make no sense to talk about the flaws and then talk about the research. So an argument against the idea of free will, of course, is Libet's research. And also Soon's research as well, that even that milliseconds before participants claim they've made a decision, there is brain activity to suggest that that decision has already been made. Okay. However, in the support of free will, there are questions around this research and the way it's conducted. For example, it's very hard to operationalize subject something as subjective as when a decision is made, and also even Libet himself did not support the idea of there is no free will at all. So Libet still supported the idea of free will, although he suggested it was more about free won't. A decision was made, and then we said. And then we decide unconsciously, and then or through it was determined through other factors, and then we decided if we were going to go through with that behaviour or not. Free will has also, the acknowledgement of free will has allowed us to develop some very effective treatments, so CBT and challenging irrational thought processes and turning them into rational ones was 90% effective. So that does support the idea of free will because we're choosing to make those decisions, or at least soft determinism. And also the concept of free will supports our current justice system as it is. So the idea that we all make conscious decisions to take part in certain behaviours. Okay. So hopefully you've breathed a slight sigh of relief. You don't need to know hundreds and hundreds of points. Just pick the ones that you feel you could. If you were told to argue for free will or argue free will, you could, or argue determinism, you could. You just need to change the wording slightly. Okay. Hopefully your first look at one of the debates wasn't quite as scary, because it is slightly different from the previous way that we structured it. But if anything, for knowing most of you in the way that you approach questions and the way you think about things, I actually think debates will suit your brains better. Having the activities we've done with you in class, where you've written for and against and drawn, made connections between things, I think debate suits your minds really well, which is very reassuring. Right? Okay, thank you very much.